I had a student request this video. We're going to talk about conditional statements. And I'm going to give you all the vocab that I cover when we talk about conditional statements. And it's very basic. This would be like your first video on conditional statements. First thing, what is a conditional statement? Well, a conditional statement is also referred to as an if-then statement. It's kind of one of the first things we talk about when we're talking about logical thinking. When you're done with this video, hopefully you'll understand hypothesis, conclusion, what a counterexample is, what the converse of a conditional is, what the inverse of a conditional is, and what the contrapositive of a conditional statement is. And again, all of this dealing with just conditional statements and the meanings revolving around those. So let's get started. So the first thing here, let's talk about a conditional. Here's one that I like to use pretty much every year. And it's, if an animal is a frog, then it is green. So this is a conditional statement. It has an if and a then. The part right here after the if is called the hypothesis, and I'm just going to abbreviate that. I showed you how to spell it on the first slide. So that's a hypothesis. It is green is the conclusion. And again, I'll abbreviate that. Okay. So that's how we dissect an if-then statement or a conditional statement. The next thing on that list, so there's the hypothesis, there's the conclusion. That's just what it is. That's where it's at. I'm not going to give you any broad definitions of those. Just be able to find them in a conditional statement. The next thing we need to talk about is counterexample. Well, we want to decide, is this statement true or is this statement false? Truth is sometimes very hard to prove. We have to talk about how we prove different things in geometry, and we're going to spend some time with that. But truth can sometimes be challenging. Now, to prove something false is really easy. All we need is one counterexample. One example that makes the first part true. So we're going to look for a frog, and the second part false. And it has to follow that. So the first part has to be true, the second part has to be false. And that is a counterexample. So in this, really easy to find a counterexample. This is a false statement. And so really quickly, if we look at this, I just Googled frogs. And if you look, yeah, those are green, 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 green. Yeah, that one's questionable. That one's questionable, but I still see green. Green, green. Oh, that one, you could still question green. But here, this one is not green, yet it is a frog. It's a poisonous frog. This one, you could say that's green, but that's all we needed, that one example. And if you look kind of at the beginning, this rainforest or poisonous frog, those are blue. So our counterexample in this case would be the blue frog I found. So all you need is one thing. There is a blue frog out there on the planet. And so this statement is false. So that is what a counterexample is. It's just one example that makes the first part true, the second part false. So we found a frog, that was true, but it was blue. So that's false. All right. The next thing we need to talk about is converse. So we'll go back to the original statement. And the original statement, again, if an animal is a frog, then it is green. The converse simply reverses the hypothesis and the conclusion. And so if, instead of an animal is a frog, I'm going to say if hilarious. Jumping again there. If an animal is green, comma, then it is a frog. Okay. So there you go. That is it. A converse just flips the hypothesis and the conclusion. Keeps everything the way it is, but it flips the hypothesis and conclusion around. Now, you can also come up with a counterexample of this if you want. And you can do that for all of them. We'll just do this one because it's fairly easy. So we need something that makes this true. So we need an animal that's green that is not necessarily a frog. So I'm assuming we could come up with that pretty fast. Like I would assume a parrot. I think parrots are green, if I misspelled parrot, but apologize for that. But a parrot is green, but it's not a frog. So I've seen green parrots. So a bird, probably other green birds out there and other green animals. So pretty much any animal that is green but is not a frog would prove that false. So there's the one example that would make that false. So that's a converse, and again another example of a counterexample. Inverse is very similar, but it deals with negation. So all it does is it takes this hypothesis and it negates it. So in other words, it makes it opposite of what it is. So if an animal, too much math today, if an animal is not a frog, so it keeps the same order, but it negates the hypothesis and conclusion, then it is not green. So we went back to the original order, but we changed the hypothesis to a not and the conclusion to a not. So it negates both of those. So if an animal is not a frog, then it is not green. That is the inverse. And finally, we're going to talk about contrapositive. So contrapositive flips the inverse. So that's kind of a quick way to refer back to it. Flip the inverse, or it's the converse of the inverse. Converse of the inverse. Kind of confusing. But if you just think, if you go back to the inverse and flip it, you're doing the contrapositive. So if an animal is not a frog, then it is not green. So let's flip that. Let's use a different color. If an animal, that should be an M, animal is not green, then it is not a frog. So I negated the hypothesis and conclusion, and I did the converse. So I flipped them. So we'll go back to the inverse just to show it again. So I kept the same order with inverse. If an animal is not a frog, then it is not green. And then the contrapositive just flips that. If the animal is not green, then it is not a frog. So if you could read my handwriting, hopefully you could. Hopefully you understand now just generally what a hypothesis and a conclusion are in a conditional statement or an if-then statement, what we can do to find a counterexample, and just generally what a converse, inverse, and contrapositive are. So hope this helps you get started with conditional statements, and I'll see you next time.